Hi, I wanted to record a video about Paul's letters. This study is mostly on his life and ministry. However, I did want to say a little bit about his letters to give us a little bit of background, because one of the places that we learn about his life is through his writings. We mainly get a timeline and a narrative of Paul's story through Luke, one of his associates and the person who wrote both the gospel that bears his name and the Acts of the Apostles. So Luke is our primary person narrating Paul and putting him into a timeline for us. But Paul himself wrote a good deal of the New Testament, and so his letters give us a window into himself, what's important to him, his theology and understanding of Christ. And he makes comments in there about who he says to say hello to, where he is, what's going on in his life, that help scholars to kind of piece the clues together to see how they work along with what Luke has said. So that's kind of how we get a timeline for Paul's life. So let's just take a look for a few minutes at Paul and his letters and just a little bit of background about them. Okay, so number one, Paul's letters are about his third option for communication. And what I mean by that is that his first option to communicate and to resolve any disputes or to share teaching or encouragement or that sort of thing the first option was to travel there himself. That's the first thing he wanted to do. If he couldn't do that, he would send one of his associates who was with him. If he couldn't make it, he would send someone on his behalf and they could carry a message. And then thirdly, he would send a letter. And that was if he wanted to speak directly to it himself, and he would send it with an associate who would read it, who would share it, possibly who would kind of expound and interpret and make sure it was clear what he was saying. But that was the third kind of option. So that's something to keep in mind, and that makes sense if you think about it for how we might do too. The first option might be to be face-to-face. The second option might be to send a message through someone. And then the third option might be to write a letter. Let's pretend that we don't have telephones for a moment. So anyway, that was where letters factored into how Paul liked to communicate. All right, second thing I'd want to say is that he wrote some letters while he was traveling, and he wrote some letters while he was stationary. So letters he wrote while he was in his missionary journeys, and those are Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and Romans. Galatians and the letters to Thessalonians and the letters to the Corinthians are to people who he's been there, he's communicating with them, he's helped to start those churches. Romans is his letter that he's writing somewhere he's never been before, but he's writing it in order to introduce himself because he aims to get there. Galatians is typically understood to be the first letter, possibly 1 Thessalonians. It depends on the scholar, but those are the two that are pretty well agreed upon. What I've read, Galatians makes sense to me, but either of those two are the ones that people generally put at the first. He also wrote letters while he was stationary, where he wasn't traveling from place to place. Those were the prison letters, which are Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. And those are written during a time when Paul is in prison, possibly in Ephesus. That makes sense of a lot of the kind of clues that are in those particular letters. There's not a time where Luke narrates Paul being in prison in Ephesus, but he's certainly there long enough by the way that Paul narrates things, and Luke narrates things, and Luke skips over large chunks of time in a sentence or two, and then we'll take a long time or take a half a chapter or so to describe a speech that Paul gave. So he's picking and choosing, and we don't know why it's not recorded there, but a number of scholars posit that because it just goes so far to explain a lot of the things. It makes sense, a lot of the details that are in some of those particular letters, those 4 letters. So the other option would be in an imprisonment that we do know about in Caesarea, up the coast in the Holy Land in Israel, north of Jerusalem. He's imprisoned there for 2 years between the time when he returns to Jerusalem for the last time and is taken under Roman guard to Rome. So we know about that one, and that would be a possibility, but the Ephesus imprisonment would make sense too. And then finally, he wrote letters to individuals. Now, Philemon, one of the letters he wrote from prison is to an individual, not to a church. But he also wrote letters, pastoral letters, kind of mentorship letters to Timothy and to Titus. 2 letters to Timothy and 1 to someone named Titus. So those are those letters. All right. A last thing I would say about the letters in terms of background is that many of the letters are written to be circular letters, particularly the prison letters. And by that we mean that they're written to perhaps a church in a particular city, but they're not meant to stop there. They're meant to be carried from church to church in that region so that they can learn the doctrine, they can be encouraged, they can be reminded of important things about the gospel and about how they should live together as the people of God. So some letters are very much targeted to a particular church. Other letters are circular letters or written to go to a church, but then also to either have copies made and then circulated around, or to take that one to have it for a while and then to go to the next place and share it with the church down the road in the next town. All right, so that's the background on the letters. The last thing I'd want to say is very briefly kind of the structure of the letters. There's a lot more I could say, but I just want to break it down into 2 basic parts. And for the most part in Paul's letters, what he's dealing with are beliefs and behavior, belief and behavior. So he wants to, perhaps he's heard about ways that people are acting that are really out of line with the gospel. This is easy to see in the letters to the Corinthians. But it really happens in all of them to some degree or another, where he has things he wants to teach them about how they ought to behave, and perhaps it's reminders of how they ought to behave. And in order to ground that with a foundation for why that makes sense and why that is the way it ought to be, he talks about beliefs, specifically what we believe about Jesus Christ, about his death on the cross, about his resurrection, about his reconciliation of us with God and with one another. So several times through the letters, you'll find that he talks about belief and doctrine and our understanding and theology about God and Christ and the cross and the resurrection, those things. And at some point, he'll either say therefore, or he'll say something like that, where it turns a corner and he starts talking about behavior, Christian ethics, justice, righteousness, how we ought to live. Now, that's kind of broad brush. Not every letter fits neatly into that pattern, but we see that pattern somehow or another in just about all the letters. A reminder, a grounding in the foundational doctrine and theology about who Christ is for us, and then, therefore, here's what I want you to do about that. If you think about that, keep that in mind, then you'll find that pattern and you'll see that dynamic. And I find that that's helpful for me because it grounds my understanding of how I ought to live and why I ought to live a certain way in a deeper foundation because it tracks back to the truth about God somehow. So those are the things I just wanted to say by word of introduction to the letters and just as a quick background. And I hope that helps as you read through the letters yourself. Thanks.